There are moments in geopolitics when the noise of headlines suddenly crystallizes into something you cannot unsee. Right now, as American fighter jets are striking targets connected to Iran, and as China and Russia stand at the United Nations forming a diplomatic shield around Tehran, we are watching one of those moments. Not a crisis, not an escalation, a confirmation of something that has been building for years beneath the surface of every press briefing, every sanctions package, every carefully worded State Department statement. What you are watching on your screen right now is not a reaction to a threat. It is the visible surface of a tectonic realignment that has been in motion for over 2 decades. And the tragedy is that most Americans are being handed a map that only shows half the territory. So let us walk the full map together. Because if you only understand what the mainstream is telling you, you are navigating a continent with a map of a city. Let us start with what is actually happening at the United Nations, because the UN Security Council has become one of the most important theaters in the world right now. Not because of what it resolves, but because of what it reveals. When China and Russia back Iran in any formal or informal capacity at the Security Council, they are not making a humanitarian argument, they are making a structural one. They are drawing a line and saying this far and no further. The veto power that both Beijing and Moscow hold is not just a procedural tool, it is a declaration of a competing world order. And every time they use it, or even position themselves to use it, they are communicating something to every nation in the global south, every country that has watched the post-1945 Western-led order operate with what they view as a profound double standard. To understand why this matters, we have to look at the deeper architecture of what Iran represents to both Russia and China, because it is not simply about Iran. Iran sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, Central Asia, and the broader Eurasian landmass. It controls the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes. It has the 4th largest proven oil reserves on the planet and the 2nd largest natural gas reserves. It shares borders with countries that Russia considers within its sphere of strategic concern, and it shares critical energy and trade corridors that China has been quietly integrating into its Belt and Road Initiative for years. When you understand that geography, you begin to understand why Iran is not a peripheral issue for Moscow or Beijing. Iran is a cornerstone. Losing Iran to Western military restructuring would be, in their strategic calculus, equivalent to losing a bishop and a rook in the same move on a chessboard where the endgame is already being calculated 5 moves ahead. Now let us talk about the American fighter jets, because the optics of this matter enormously. The United States deploying air power in the context of Iranian-linked targets is not new. What is new is the timing, the diplomatic backdrop, and what it signals about the strategic patience running out in Washington. For years, the United States has operated on a model of maximum pressure, using sanctions, proxy conflicts, and periodic military signaling to contain Iran without triggering a full-scale war. That model has largely failed to produce the behavioral change Washington wanted. Iran has not collapsed. Iran has not capitulated. Iran has, in fact, deepened its ties with Russia and China, expanded its regional influence through networks in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, and has advanced its nuclear enrichment program to levels that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. So ask yourself this, and I want you to genuinely sit with this question. If maximum pressure has not worked in over 2 decades, what does it tell you about the real objective of that policy? Because here's the critical realization I want you to hold on to, and we will fully unpack this in the final part of today's analysis. The policy was never solely designed to change Iran's behavior. It was designed to manage a narrative, to maintain a posture, and to serve a set of interests that go far beyond the Islamic Republic of Iran. We will come back to that. But first, let us build the full picture. The relationship between Russia, China, and Iran has evolved from one of tactical convenience into something far more structurally significant. After the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, Russia found itself under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. Overnight, Russia needed reliable partners who could provide trade alternatives, technology transfers, and diplomatic cover. Iran, having lived under severe Western sanctions for decades, was essentially a school that Russia enrolled in out of necessity. Iran has spent 40 years learning how to build parallel financial systems, route oil through gray market channels, develop domestic manufacturing capacity under technology denial regimes, and sustain political cohesion under constant external pressure. That is not a trivial body of knowledge, and Russia, which had never truly needed those skills before 2022, began absorbing them rapidly. China's relationship with Iran is different in texture but equally strategic. Beijing has pursued a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement with Tehran that, when you read it carefully, is essentially a long-term bet that Iran will become a central node in the Eurasian economic architecture. Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure, energy, and technology is not charity, it is positioning. It is Beijing buying optionality in a region where American influence has been the dominant variable for 7 decades, and where Chinese planners see that influence as declining. The Iranian market, the Iranian geography, and the Iranian energy reserves all serve China's long game. And China is, above all things, a civilization that thinks in long games. Now let me bring you into the room where these decisions are being made in Washington, because the American strategic establishment is not naive about any of this. The people in the room at the Pentagon, at Langley, at the State Department, they understand the Eurasian realignment. They read the same geopolitical literature you and I read. They understand Mackinder. They understand Brzezinski. They understand that control of the Eurasian heartland is the foundational logic of Anglo-American grand strategy going back more than a century. What they are dealing with right now is a situation where the tools that worked for a unipolar world are being applied to a multipolar one, and the fit is getting worse with every passing year. The fighter jets striking targets are not a sign of strength in the traditional sense. They are a sign of an establishment that is caught between the world it built and the world that is actually emerging. To understand the economics underneath all of this, we have to talk about something that rarely appears in mainstream coverage, and that is the gradual erosion of the dollar's role as the uncontested global reserve currency. Now, I want to be precise here, because this is a process, not an event. The dollar is not going to collapse next Tuesday, but the directionality is undeniable if you are looking at the right indicators. Russia and China have been settling bilateral trade in their own currencies for several years now. The BRICS grouping, which now includes Iran as a member, has been actively discussing alternative payment mechanisms that reduce exposure to the SWIFT system, which the United States and its allies weaponized against Russia in 2022. When you weaponize the global financial system, you send a message to every country in the world that is not in your inner circle. You are vulnerable. And rational actors, when they feel vulnerable, diversify. That is not anti-Americanism. That is basic risk management. Iran's inclusion in BRICS is one of the most underreported geopolitical developments of the past several years. Think about what that means structurally. Iran is now embedded in an economic and diplomatic bloc that includes Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Ethiopia. That bloc represents, depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 40 and 45% of the world's population and roughly 30% of global GDP. The United States and its Western allies are not dealing with an isolated rogue state when they deal with Iran. They are dealing with a state that has integration points, economic lifelines, and diplomatic backing across the majority of the non-Western world. The military strikes and the UN posturing have to be understood in that context, because what plays well in a domestic American news cycle plays very differently in New Delhi, in Riyadh, in Brasilia, and in Beijing. And I want to ask you something directly, because this is the kind of question I think deserves real reflection from people who understand history. When has air power alone, without a coherent political strategy, ever produced lasting stability in the Middle East? Go through the record. Libya in 2011, reduced to a failed state and a slave market. Iraq in 2003, a trillion-dollar catastrophe that empowered Iran more than any other single event in modern history. Syria, where a decade of proxy conflict produced only rubble and a refugee crisis. Yemen, where a Saudi air campaign backed by Western intelligence and weapons has produced what the United Nations has called one of the worst humanitarian disasters on Earth. The pattern is not coincidental. It is the predictable result of applying tactical military power to problems that are fundamentally political, economic, and civilizational in nature. But to understand why Washington keeps returning to this playbook, we have to look at something that most geopolitical analysts are reluctant to name directly, and that is the institutional structure of the American national security state and its relationship to the industries that profit from sustained conflict. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is Eisenhower's farewell address. This is the revolving door between the Pentagon and defense contractors that every serious scholar of American foreign policy acknowledges. When you understand that Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman have shareholders, lobbyists, and board members embedded in the very institutions that make decisions about when and where to deploy force, you begin to understand that national interest and corporate interest are not always the same vector, even when they are dressed in the same uniform. This connects to the critical realization I asked you to hold earlier. The policy framework around Iran, the sanctions, the maximum pressure campaigns, the periodic military strikes, the diplomatic isolation attempts, these are not simply failed strategies. They are successful strategies at achieving a different objective than the stated one. The stated objective is behavioral change in Tehran. The actual objective, viewed through a structural lens, is the maintenance of a particular kind of Middle Eastern order, one in which American military presence is indispensable, in which energy markets are calibrated to serve certain interests, and in which the threat of Iran, perpetually managed but never resolved, justifies a security architecture that is enormously profitable for a small number of very powerful actors. Peace with Iran, real structural economic peace, would be destabilizing not to America, but to the infrastructure of American power projection in the region. And that is a distinction worth making very carefully. Now I want to bring this back to Russia and China at the United Nations, because their posture there is not simply defensive. It is constructive in a specific sense. Both Moscow and Beijing are in the process of building what you might call a counter-legitimacy architecture. They are funding, staffing, and politically backing alternative institutions, the SCO, the BRICS framework, new development banks, alternative payment systems, and they are using the UN Security Council as a public stage to demonstrate that Western unilateralism has structural limits. Every veto, every joint statement, every diplomatic backing of a sanctioned state sends a message to the world's undecided nations. There is another room to sit in. You do not have to accept Washington's terms as the only terms available. The global South is listening to that message very carefully. And when you look at how countries voted in the UN General Assembly on resolutions related to the Ukraine conflict, when you look at which nations refused to join Western sanctions regimes against Russia, when you look at which countries are deepening economic ties with China despite American pressure, you see a pattern that should be deeply sobering for anyone who believes in the permanence of American primacy. Primacy is not a fact of nature, it is a function of relative power, relative legitimacy, and relative attractiveness as a partner. On all three of those dimensions, the United States is dealing with serious structural headwinds that fighter jets and Security Council theatrics cannot resolve. What does this mean for the average American who is watching these strikes on their television and trying to make sense of it all? I think it means this. The world you are being shown is real in the sense that the planes exist, the strikes are happening, the diplomats are speaking. But the world you are not being shown is the one that will determine your children's future. The realignment underway between Russia, China, Iran, and a growing number of global South nations is not a temporary coalition of convenience. It is the early architecture of a post-American world order, imperfect, unstable, full of its own internal contradictions, but directionally coherent. And the question you have to ask yourself, the question I want you to leave in the comments below with your honest, informed perspective, is this: is the American foreign policy establishment capable of adapting to this reality, or is it structurally committed to a response set that was designed for a world that no longer exists? Because the answer to that question will determine not just what happens in Iran, not just what Russia and China do at the UN next month, but whether the United States navigates this transition with its institutions, its alliances, and its credibility intact. The strikes will end, the Security Council session will close, but the realignment will continue. It continued through every previous cycle of escalation, it will continue through this one, and somewhere in a room in Beijing, in a military planning office in Moscow, in a diplomatic corridor in Tehran, people are watching the same footage you are watching right now, and they are not afraid. They are patient, and in geopolitics, patience is the most decisive weapon of all.